Welcome to Infidelity Cheating Tales. If you too get lost in this world of stories, then join us. Every story has a feeling, a lesson, and a new hope hidden in it. Subscribe so that you can be a part of this journey and the heart-touching stories reach you first. Your one subscription inspires us to bring even better stories. During the seminar, I often found myself thinking about how to balance my work and personal life. The seminar ended a day earlier than planned, but I couldn't manage to reschedule my flight. I informed my wife, Emily, that I'd have to stay an extra day. She was set to pick me up at the airport on Tuesday night around 6 p.m. Though she expressed some disappointment about my extended absence, she ultimately said she'd be happy to see me. As I reflected on being away from home for so long, I started feeling a sense of guilt. Emily and I have shared 17 years of a deep relationship, and I felt like I should make an extra effort for her. When I arrived at the airport, I wondered if I could change my plans. That thought gave me a spark of hope. I checked for flights and was pleasantly surprised to find one departing in half an hour to a smaller airport near our hometown. This airport was south of our home, about 2 hours away, while the airport I typically use is an hour north. Although it was less convenient, I decided to give it a try. I quickly purchased a ticket. The process was surprisingly smooth and fast, which filled me with relief. During the flight, I thought about how much of a surprise this would be for Emily. I imagined how thrilled she'd be to see me return unexpectedly. When I landed, I immediately rented a car. If all went well, I calculated I'd be home around midnight. On the drive, I thought about ways to make my return even more special. I decided not to tell her and let it be a complete surprise. When I arrived home close to midnight, I noticed that the house was entirely dark. That struck me as odd since Emily usually left a few lights on at night. Even more surprising, her car wasn't there. I dismissed it as a coincidence and went inside. The house was eerily quiet. I brought my bags in, unpacked, and started wondering where Emily might be. My mind was racing with questions about her whereabouts. I called her on my phone. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice sounded calm and composed. Trying to act casual, I greeted her. She told me she was about to go to bed and planned to wake up early to pick me up from the airport. Her response seemed strange to me. I asked her where she was at the moment, and she insisted she was at home. I mentioned that I had tried calling the landline, but there had been no answer. She explained that the landline was broken and that someone was scheduled to fix it. Her tone was so matter-of-fact that it made me even more suspicious. I tried convincing myself that I was overthinking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told her my flight plans had changed and that I'd be staying out of town for a few more days. She expressed her desire for me to come back soon, and I reassured her that I'd return as quickly as possible. When the call ended, I couldn't help but notice the faint hint of a smile in her voice, which made me uneasy. After the call, I tried the landline again. This time it rang normally. That deepened my suspicion. I started searching the house thoroughly, looking into every corner, but found nothing unusual. Throughout the night, I struggled to quiet my mind. Questions about Emily's behavior kept swirling in my head. Was she hiding something from me? My thoughts ran wild with possibilities. The next morning, I woke up early. I parked the rental car across the street and decided to wait and observe. Around 7 a.m., I saw Emily's car approaching the house. The most shocking part was that someone else was driving it. I hid in the storage closet, leaving the foyer door slightly ajar so I could see what was happening. Emily unlocked the door and they walked in together. She told him she needed to change clothes and get ready for work. She mentioned grabbing some clothes for the next day to avoid having to return in the morning and said she'd be back in 10 minutes. He laughed and replied that he'd help her, but only if she promised to fall in love with him again. Emily jokingly warned him that if he showed up late, she might have to fire him and teased him about how much he seemed to enjoy working under her. He laughed and commented on how his wife thought Emily was the perfect secretary. I couldn't help but wonder what he had told his wife about her, especially considering how disdainful and arrogant he seemed. From what I remembered, he had only been at the company for a few weeks. He laughed again and mentioned that he had already told his wife about Emily, describing her as old enough to be her mother and significantly thinner. He joked that if his wife ever met Emily, she'd probably insist he fire her immediately. He also mentioned that he had informed his wife he was house hunting that week and couldn't stay at the hotel for too long. A few moments later, Emily rejoined him, and their conversation was filled with laughter and jokes. She looked stunningly confident as they talked. His name was Mr. Boss. They hugged, and he gave her a slow, passionate kiss. My blood boiled with anger. I reached for an umbrella on the shelf, trying to contain my rage. He then suggested they spend the next evening together, go out for dinner, and be back by 8 p.m. He also mentioned the possibility of showing her a lodge he was considering renting. Emily agreed and jokingly asked what kind of tour he had in mind and what would happen if her husband came home early. His name was Jeff. Jeff reassured her that he'd call me to arrange a pickup at the airport and ensure I'd give a day's notice. He emphasized that if I didn't call today, I wouldn't be coming home the next day. Emily found this reassuring and laughingly commented that I was predictable, capable of handling any unexpected issues. She joked that if I ever faced a problem, Jeff could simply offer me a beer and an apology. Jeff jokingly added that if his wife ever caught him cheating, she'd be furious and likely make his life difficult. Emily quipped that fear often kept men in line, though she admitted he didn't seem too scared most of the time. Jeff responded that if he ever cheated on his wife, he'd be in serious trouble and lucky to survive. He said his wife was currently in Houston, which made him feel relatively safe. As they left the room, I stopped listening. My face burned with anger, and I felt my blood pressure rising. Not only was my wife unfaithful, but she also seemed to dislike me. I sat down to process the situation and slowly began forming a plan. I recalled Emily mentioning that her new boss was relocating from the company's Houston headquarters to Springfield. I needed to know his full name. So I made a few discreet phone calls to the receptionist at Emily's workplace, asking some cleverly worded questions. Before long, I had all the information I needed. His name was Jeffrey Ross. He was married with 2 teenage kids. His wife and children were staying in Texas until the school year ended, after which they would join him in Springfield. Jeffrey spent his evenings house hunting after work. I searched for people named Ross in Houston using an online directory and found 3 listings for Jeff Ross. With my first call, I hit the jackpot. I called a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Jeffrey Ross. Politely, I asked if her husband worked for the Halifax company. She confirmed and asked how she could assist me. I introduced myself as Don Watson, a representative from Halifax, and explained that we were planning a small event for her husband, Jeff. I mentioned that it was a surprise and that round-trip tickets to Springfield had been arranged for him. She responded positively and asked for the date of the event. Avoiding a direct answer, I told her it would take place the following evening. I provided her with the flight details and explained that the company would reimburse Jeff for the expenses. Emphasizing the need for confidentiality, I requested she not share this information with anyone, and she promised to keep it a secret. Next, I began calling Emily's friends and family to invite them to a surprise party. I told them Emily had been promoted by her boss, making it the perfect reason to celebrate. Everyone was thrilled with the explanation and agreed to keep it a surprise from Emily. I asked them to arrive at our home by 7 p.m. to ensure everything went smoothly. I then contacted a local restaurant to arrange food and drinks, specifying that they be set up on our veranda near the living room next to the pool. This detail was particularly important because Emily had always dreamed of having a party on that veranda. I left instructions for the caterers, explaining that the house might be empty when they arrived, but that they could walk around to the outdoor area to set everything up. The next day, I arrived at the airport half an hour early to ensure I was on time. As passengers made their way toward the baggage area, I approached a few women and asked if they were Mrs. Ross. While speaking with one woman, I heard someone addressing me. She introduced herself as Mrs. Ross and asked if I was there to pick her up. I was momentarily speechless. She looked stunning, like a movie star. I introduced myself as Ron and mentioned that my wife worked for her husband. Sensing some suspicion in her demeanor, I joked that people often told me my wife looked older than me, but I reassured her that it was only because she had more experience and a lot more to offer in terms of love. She considered this for a moment, then smiled, putting me at ease. We collected her luggage and made our way to the car. When we reached my house at 6:30 p.m., I explained to Mrs. Ross that the event was an outdoor party in her husband's honor and also a celebration of my wife's birthday. As guests began arriving, the caterers finished setting up. I was genuinely impressed at how it all came together. It looked like a top-tier party. I hadn't realized such an event could be organized so seamlessly. By 7:30 p.m., everyone I'd invited was in place. I had asked them to park half a block away behind the church to keep the path to our house clear. I explained to the guests that I'd be hiding in the living room. When the guests of honor approached the house, I would turn off the veranda lights as a signal for everyone to remain quiet. We had sliding glass doors leading to the veranda, along with vertical blinds that could be adjusted using cords. One cord opened the blinds horizontally, while the other separated them. We also had heavy curtains typically used during the colder months. These curtains were large enough for me to hide behind easily. As I reached for the cords to close the blinds and turned off the veranda lights, it was just a few minutes before 8 p.m. I saw Emily as the car pulled up in front of the house. I turned off the deck lights and hid behind the curtains, creating a calm atmosphere. The door opened, and I could hear Emily and Jeff laughing. It was reassuring to know they were enjoying themselves. Jeff playfully mentioned how rare it was for them to have a private moment, expressing his eagerness for some alone time. He helped Emily remove her dress, revealing she was only wearing a thong. They both seemed to be in high spirits. Emily, in a playful mood, adjusted her thong and teased Jeff about his relentless flirtation. He gently pushed her onto the chair, and their interaction began cautiously. I turned on the lights. Emily was startled and immediately demanded an explanation for my presence. Her question, given the situation, seemed somewhat naive to me. I calmly reminded her that this was my house, emphasizing that my name was on the deed. Emily expressed surprise at my early return, which I nonchalantly acknowledged. Jeff mumbled something about needing to leave and take care of matters, but I offered him a drink, which caught both of them off guard. I could tell Jeff was processing the situation, wondering how I would react. I couldn't help but smirk as I observed his train of thought. Meanwhile, Emily's wife suddenly entered the room, holding a large bag and waving it furiously. Her arrival shocked Jeff, making him stumble back almost 5 feet from where he was. Soon after, Emily's mother and sister arrived at the scene. Emily, still undressed, was scolded. Her mother instructed her to put on clothes and jokingly suggested she consider a career in adult entertainment after her recent display. Emily was too stunned to respond. When I turned on the porch lights, she realized that about 20 other people were outside watching. Ignoring the chaos, I went outside, grabbed some potato salad and wings, and brought a beer from the fridge. Returning to my seat, I observed Jeff struggling to find a place to sit while Emily tried to regain her composure. The entire situation was undeniably awkward. I couldn't help but reflect that I wasn't responsible for this mess. Emily and Jeff had placed themselves in this uncomfortable position among their loved ones. Eventually, things settled down. Emily's cousin took her mother to a motel, while another cousin helped Jeff to his car and offered to drive him to a motel as well. Emily's mother asked if Emily wanted to join them, but she declined. Her mother expressed understanding about my potential discomfort and admitted that Emily deserved a scolding, but felt she had already suffered enough. Then they left. Emily hid in the bathroom, and I could hear the shower running. Sitting alone, I enjoyed my beer and wings, reflecting on the evening's events. I thought to myself that sometimes, in life, everything aligns perfectly according to plan. After finishing my food, I started cleaning up. It took quite a while to store the leftovers in the fridge and freezer. It was well past midnight when I finally sat at the table with my last beer of the evening. Emily walked into the room and sat across from me. I asked her directly, "Are you happy?" From her expressions, I could tell what her answer might be. She looked at me and asked why people form such opinions. I wondered if I had given anyone a reason to think that way. Reflecting on it, I questioned whether she herself might have done something. In response, she brought up the incident when I was caught talking to my boss. She expressed her belief that anyone might misinterpret it. She then voiced her frustration that I had chosen to involve the whole neighborhood rather than coming to her directly with our issue. Smiling, I asked her, "Do we really have a problem?" She defended herself, saying she never intended to be rude to me and trusted that I wouldn't behave like that either. She accused me of deliberately trying to hurt her. I responded, "Seriously, how could hosting a surprise party for my beloved wife be worse than being unfaithful in our marriage?" I reminded her that most people wouldn't agree with her perspective. Eventually, she said what I had been waiting to hear for so long. She argued that none of this would have happened if I had been more present. She claimed I hadn't given her enough attention, which made her vulnerable to someone else's advances. I couldn't help but laugh at her reasoning. She expected me to apologize for her actions, but her behavior seemed so childish to me that I simply walked into my room, locked the door, and left it at that. In that moment, I felt like my chains had broken. I was emotionally free, and soon I would be legally free as well. I was eagerly awaiting my new life, but this was just the beginning. Now, let's dive into another exciting story. I know I should be at work right now, but instead I'm sitting at my kitchen table, enjoying a freshly brewed cup of coffee. That cup of coffee was calming my nerves. This had been a cherished routine of mine, early mornings in silence, before the rest of the household stirred. When the kids were little, I'd steal a few peaceful moments like this before the chaos began. My name is Evan Johnson. After 25 years of a happy marriage, up until a few hours ago, I was a happily married man. We have 4 kids, and our youngest moved out last year. My wife, Audrey, seemed to be struggling with what they call the empty nest syndrome. I encouraged her to find a hobby, and it seems she found one a little over an hour ago. However, I had no idea what it was. She kept referring to someone as Stallion and giving him orders. Despite the aroma of my favorite coffee filling the house, their activities continued uninterrupted. Usually, Audrey would come downstairs the moment she smelled coffee brewing, but today, she was too preoccupied with something else. As I overheard bits of their conversation, it became increasingly clear that something was amiss. When I walked into the living room, I saw a police uniform and gear belt lying on the floor alongside my wife's clothes. Their words left no room for doubt. "Come on, baby. Do it harder for me. I've never felt this way since you came along," Audrey said. Their passionate exchange echoed through the walls. The rhythmic creaking of the bed and the steady thumping of the headboard against the wall made it impossible for me to focus on anything else. At that moment, I made a firm decision. I put the safety lock on my gun, a wise move considering her lover was a cop. With my thoughts clear, I walked out of the room. I felt a deep sense of peace. My chains were broken. I was emotionally free. And soon, I'd be legally free too. I was ready to start my new life. I couldn't say for sure how much time I had, but judging by the duration of their activities in what used to be my bedroom, a space I had no intention of re-entering, it seemed like I had plenty of time. It was clear to me that this wasn't their first meeting. I heard my wife say, "Damn it, baby. We need to find a way to meet 2 or 3 times a week instead of just occasionally." That sentiment came from my dear wife. Or at least I believe that's what she said. Thinking about how this nightmare began, I remembered I had left for work but forgot my briefcase. I had left it in the garage after using it to rescue a cat stuck under my car hood. Afterward, I completely forgot about the briefcase. This habit of checking under the hood came from an incident years ago when our first cat, Clarence, tragically died on a cold winter morning. I had started the car without checking, and the fan belt ended his life. The sound of a cat caught in a spinning fan belt at nearly 1,000 revolutions per minute is unforgettable. The fur flying around Clarence wasn't the smartest move, and neither was I. Ever since, I swore never to make such a mistake again. Deciding that the briefcase wasn't critical, I left for work without it. However, a client meeting redirected me back to my house. As I turned onto my street, I immediately noticed a black and white police car parked outside. A stabbing fear shot through me. I thought something terrible must have happened to my devoted wife. Driving hastily, I nearly collided with her brand-new silver Lexus sedan. Her plaster garden gnome wasn't so lucky. Without even bothering to shut the car door, I rushed inside the house. That's how I ended up here, sitting with a cup of coffee, trying to pull myself together. At that moment, I thought whiskey might have been more fitting, but I knew I needed a clear head. Their passion-filled screams were incredibly disturbing. And then, I saw it. The sight was unbearable, but I felt compelled to watch, if only to record the necessary video and audio. Honestly, it wasn't their physical actions that hurt the most. It was the verbal insults my wife threw at me. She said, "God, you're so much better than Evan. Give it to me, baby." Apparently, this encouraged her lover as the bed and the entire house began to shake. Her insults and his growling intensified, as if a storm had descended in the middle of a cold December night. It's a real shock when you find your wife sleeping with her lover in your marital bed. Yes, they did it right in front of me, or at least in my home. My wife, out of breath, was riding him in a cowgirl style, telling him how much it turned her on. That's when I ran to the bathroom, leaned over the toilet, and threw up my breakfast. I was surprised they neither heard nor smelled it. I guess they were too deeply engrossed in their activities to notice. It was hard for me to believe what I was witnessing, even as I listened to it. My wife was 50, and the man she was with couldn't have been more than 30. He was in excellent shape, while my wife was hardly a match for him. I may not be in the best shape myself, but why go after someone else's wife in such a scenario? It just didn't make any sense. The ordeal felt like it lasted forever, but after about 90 minutes, things suddenly went quiet. I assumed they'd taken a break. Then I heard my wife asking, "What's that smell?" Her lover didn't respond, but I heard her exclaim, "Oh my God!" What followed was a chaotic shuffling of closet doors, dresser drawers, and laundry baskets being slammed shut. I assumed they were trying to clean up any evidence of their affair. Mentally, I made a note to get tested for STDs. They noticed me around the same time. Audrey gasped when she saw me standing there. Her lover did the same, glancing toward his uniform, looking almost crestfallen that it wasn't there. I couldn't resist asking, "What's your branch of service?" He looked like he wanted to disappear, his lips trembling in frustration. He dropped to his knees, losing the sheet in the process, and frantically searched through the pile on the floor. It was almost amusing when he muttered something about his throwing hand, clearly upset about the serial number being scratched off. Apparently, former Officer Stad Johnson wasn't having a great day. He seemed crushed by this revelation, even though he was a thoughtful guy, or so he tried to come across. While you two lovebirds were busy upstairs, he and I had a good chat. Audrey quickly glanced out the window toward the street and muttered, "Yes." He took the patrol car. Your boss, as it turns out, had mentioned you were providing security at a construction site. He'd taken your patrol car, along with any credibility you might have had left, but back to the situation at hand. Your wife could have called someone to pick you up, but she wasn't too concerned. That video I emailed her probably had something to do with it. She was muttering about her father, the police chief, and something about, "How could you do this to your kids?" She seemed baffled by your choices, despite telling me how good you looked, given the situation. Frankly, I was enjoying myself at this point. It felt like reeling in a fish on the line. I would have suggested your wife drive you, but her car had been impounded. Audrey's scream filled the room. The police impounded your car, Audrey, I told her, because there were a few ounces of unaccounted-for marijuana on the front seat. Sergeant Mark said they usually just write a ticket, but with all the trouble you caused the department, they felt you owed them. They assured me not to worry. You could probably pick up the car in a few days after they finished their forensic investigation. Oh, God, she moaned. By now, it wasn't a scream anymore. It was a sorrowful lament. A lone hunting dog, howling at the moon, announces its presence to the world. Just like that, officer, I believe it's time for you to put on your uniform and leave. As soon as he walked out, my wife finally regained her voice. She took a deep breath and said, "Eve, I love you." I swear, it didn't mean anything. It was all just a facade or something like that. With a cold smile, I replied, "I wish you'd told me earlier. I was so confused about your feelings and thought you were going to leave me. But now I feel bad for overreacting." She looked at me and said, "Do you know that I love you?" "Yes, but does it even matter anymore?" I replied. Her eyes filled with tears as she softly asked, "Eve, why did you do this?" I responded without any emotion. Was it all just infidelity? Or something more? I still remember how you pulled your lover to your side of the bed and called me a fool. But maybe that's just my imagination. Running her hands through her hair, she said, "You're blowing this out of proportion. I never did that. It was just bedroom talk to get us in the mood." I took a deep breath. "Wait, you said you overreacted. What does that mean, Eve? What else did you do?" Now she looked a little nervous. Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm sorry. But when I thought you didn't love me anymore, I made a video. I sent that video to our kids so they could know who their new father would be." Hearing this, I replied in a calm tone, "Maybe you should have waited before sending that video. The kids' reaction was the opposite of what you expected. They were upset, Eve. They couldn't believe it." She stared at me as if expecting an answer. I continued, "What did you think? That this would be easy? And your lover's wife? Did you know she works in the same company as you?" I assured her that I wouldn't get anyone fired, but your transfer to Little Rock might be finalized. Now fear was evident in her eyes. Gathering her courage, she said, "Why are you being so cruel, Evan?" I took a deep breath and replied, "I'm not being cruel. I just wanted the truth to come out. I sent your picture to your lover's wife. She wanted to know if there was something going on between you two. Also, I've shared a copy of the video with your office and your family. I did all this because I knew people would want to know what's happening in your life." Audrey was now completely broken. She sat on the floor, crying, clutching a blanket around herself and muttering, "This can't be happening to me. This has to be a nightmare." I looked at her and said, "Now get up. Get dressed and pack your bags. Your parents will be here to pick you up. You can't stay in this house anymore. As part of the divorce, the house will have to be sold. It's already been decided." Audrey's eyes were filled with countless questions. In a tired voice, she asked, "Why, Evan? Why did you do this? When you found out, what did you think would happen? Did you expect me to get caught?" I shook my head and said, "This is the consequence of your actions, Audrey. I just wanted the truth, and now the truth is out. Should we keep up this unexpected conversation for a while?" The floor above was completely silent, and she barely spoke a word. Aside from occasional sobs, there was no sound. Why is it that cheaters often start crying when they get caught? It's truly ironic. If getting caught is so unbearable, then please don't cheat in the first place. About 10 minutes later, she came downstairs, but without her suitcase. "Evan, dear, we really—" That's all she could say. Then I noticed her parents' car pulling up in front of our house. This was probably the final goodbye. As always, I showed courtesy and held the door open for her. Still, that was quite a story. Now let's move on to the next one, which didn't go as smoothly as I had imagined. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. I tried looking for my wife, Helen, and the kids, but they were nowhere to be found. Helen and I had been married for 11 years. When I realized how silent the house was, I noticed a note on the table. It read, "Mike, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person, but I've met someone else, and I've fallen in love. The kids are with me and are safe. The divorce papers are in the envelope below this note. As you can see, I'm not asking you for anything." Helen's message turned my world upside down. After looking at the divorce papers, I finally collapsed onto a chair. She had proposed leaving the house and all our money behind. She was only taking the kids and their clothes with her. The most painful part was her request. She wanted me to consent to the kids being adopted by her new partner. Angry and confused, I decided to call her. "Helen," I said. She replied plainly, "Hi, Mike." I asked, "What's going on?" She repeated what she'd written in the note. Bitterly, I said, "No one just up and leaves a marriage like this and starts living with someone else." Afterward, I decided to change my mood and went out to eat. From there, I headed to a bar. There, I ran into my friend Paul. He asked, "How are you here tonight?" I replied, "Just came back to an empty house with divorce papers." When I told him Helen had left me for Henry Carslake, he was shocked. Paul asked, "Is it the same Carslake who owns the construction business?" I confirmed it was. Paul then asked about my plans. I said, "I'm divorcing her because she doesn't want anything from me, but I'm not agreeing to the adoption." Paul was furious. He said, "Why are you even working for him?" I replied, "I'm supposed to start working for him on Monday." Eventually, I decided to look for another job. Despite Helen's efforts to persuade me otherwise, I signed the divorce papers. Once the divorce was finalized, she finally stopped trying to convince me. Chloe was 10 years old and Lee was 8. I wanted to get back at Carslake, but I didn't want to go to jail for it. I never showed up for work on Monday, and strangely, no one seemed to follow up. It was as if there was no pressure on me regarding it. Part of my revenge against Carslake happened without my direct involvement. It stemmed from a conversation I had with Paul, which eventually spread to others. Most of the local contractors refused to work with Carslake after seeing how he had treated me. His projects were rejected one by one. Although Henry found other contractors, they were of poor quality. 6 months later, the quality of his work began to decline. 3 months after my divorce became official, Helen married Goyuk. When they went on their honeymoon, I cared for the kids for a week. It wasn't out of kindness toward Helen. I just wanted to make the most of the time I had with my children. One thing that bothered me during that week was a question from Chloe. "Dad, why did you send us to live with Mom and Henry?" I replied, "I didn't send you. Your mom took you because she doesn't love me anymore. If it were up to me, you'd still be here with me." I made it clear that it wasn't my decision and told her I planned to discuss it with Helen. When Helen came to pick up the kids, she looked both somber and smug. I told her to stop lying and urged her to tell the kids the truth. I warned her that if she didn't, I would. The children already knew I hadn't willingly let them go, and I informed her that if I could, I'd fight for custody. Helen left looking defeated. Life as a single man after being married for so long felt strange. Some friends tried to set me up on dates, but I wasn't in the mood for dating. I wanted love, but I wasn't ready to jump back into the dating world. Meanwhile, my neighbors, Gary and Emily, had moved in shortly after Helen left. The house they bought was a good deal, but needed a lot of work. Emily worked as a secretary, and Gary was a retired military man. We got along well, and they seemed like a lovely couple. Tragedy struck when Gary suddenly fell ill at work. Paramedics and a doctor arrived quickly, but Gary was pronounced dead on the spot. The autopsy revealed he had passed away due to a subdural hematoma. Emily was devastated and alone. I offered my condolences, and since her parents were out of town, I went over to her place to keep her company. We had a drink, and as she started to cry, she shared her plans for the future. Eventually, Emily fell asleep on my couch. I covered her with a blanket and slept in a chair nearby in case she woke up during the night. The next morning, as Emily was leaving, Helen arrived to drop off the kids. "Wasting no time, are you, Mike?" Helen said, noticing Emily leaving. She gave me a look but said nothing more. Later that day, I explained to the kids why Emily had been at my house. Chloe looked sad, while I wasn't sure Lee fully understood. Emily later invited me to attend Gary's funeral, which I accepted. Thankfully, mortgages are insured in the UK, so Emily wouldn't be left financially stranded. It was a small comfort given her loss. Emily's parents returned from Europe after the funeral and assured me they appreciated me looking out for her. Aside from her colleagues, I was her only real friend. When Helen came to pick up the kids next time, she stayed in the car, which suited me fine. I didn't want to talk to her anyway. Over time, Emily and I spent quite a bit of time together, not as a couple, but as friends supporting one another. About a year later, I overheard Lee chatting with Emily in the garden. I called him back, telling him not to be a bother. Emily, however, reassured me it was fine as she hung clothes on the line. I suggested Emily join us for dinner that evening, and she agreed. Lee wanted Emily to join us for dinner and make the evening special. She always believed in including everyone in such gatherings. When Emily arrived at our house, her presence brightened the atmosphere. She helped me prepare the dinner, and it was clear that she was quite skilled in the kitchen. She handled everything so efficiently that the meal was ready on time. During dinner, we had an open and delightful conversation. Emily shared stories from her childhood, and I shared a few anecdotes from my own life. Chloe, my daughter, and everyone else listened to her intently. Emily's personality was so captivating that she won everyone over. After dinner, she not only helped clean the table, but also assisted with the kitchen cleanup. As Emily was preparing to leave, I thanked her for her help. Just as she was leaving, Chloe jokingly asked me if Emily was my girlfriend. Hearing this, I smiled and replied that Emily was just a friend and neighbor. However, deep down, I thought about how wonderful it would be if she were my girlfriend. Still, I kept this thought to myself. On Sunday afternoon, Helen, my ex-wife, came to pick up the kids. I had a feeling that the kids had told her about Emily joining us for dinner. The next time she came to pick them up, she began asking questions about Emily. She was curious about who Emily was and what role she played in my life. I clearly told her that Emily was just a friend and that my decisions had nothing to do with Helen anymore. Helen commented that she never got everything she wanted in life. Hearing this, I stayed silent for a moment and then replied that she had chosen a luxurious life over me. She expressed regret about her decision to adopt our children, but I made it clear that I had no role in that choice. Our conversation ended on a bitter note, and she left quietly. Meanwhile, I hadn't seen Emily for a few weeks because I was busy with work. My friend Paul was working on a big project and had called me for help. He was renovating a house for a young couple. I helped him complete the plumbing work, which took about 2 weeks. Once the project was finished, I finally got some free time and invited Emily out for dinner. On Saturday night, when Emily arrived, I was mesmerized by her beauty. She had a pixie-cut hairstyle, and her outfit exuded simplicity and confidence. Dinner was amazing. We talked about our lives, future plans, and shared a lot of personal stories. When I dropped her off at her home, she stopped me at the door and surprised me with a passionate kiss. For a moment, I was speechless, but then I realized that I liked her too. She suggested that we meet again. After that, we started spending more time together and grew closer. Eventually, Emily decided to sell her house and move in with us. This decision made my kids very happy because they were comfortable spending time with her. However, Helen didn't take this well. She felt like someone else was replacing her in my life, although she didn't say anything to me directly. A year after Emily and I first met, we got married. When the kids told Helen about the wedding, she pretended to ignore it, but I knew the news bothered her. Over time, my life found peace. Emily and I had 2 children together, Gary and Robert. My older kids had grown up enough to visit Helen on their own. This reduced my interactions with her significantly. I was content with my life, and it was clear that Emily had become an integral part of it. Years passed, and one day my daughter Chloe announced her engagement. Her fiancé, Josh, had proposed to her, and it felt like a new beginning for our family. Chloe shared with her father that initially she thought financial support wouldn't be necessary. However, Henry offered to cover the expenses on the condition that he would walk her down the aisle. Chloe refused, and in retaliation, Henry withdrew his financial support, leaving her distressed. I was disappointed with Henry's behavior. Emily suggested using the money from the sale of her house to cover the costs. Initially, I hesitated, considering it was her money, but she insisted, encouraging me to inform Chloe that we would take care of her wedding expenses. When I shared the news with Chloe, she was overjoyed. Together, we created a budget that accommodated everything Chloe and Josh wanted while staying within our means. The next day, Chloe informed me that Henry was furious, and Helen was visibly unhappy. One afternoon, Lee showed up unexpectedly in our garden, asking if he could stay at our place because he was tired of listening to his mother and Henry argue. Emily inquired if the argument was still about the wedding, but Lee revealed it was something else entirely. He mentioned overhearing intimate moments and hinted that Henry wasn't performing well in bed. We shared a laugh about the situation, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that Helen had left me for someone who couldn't meet her needs. Lee decided to stay over at our house to avoid any fights at home. On Chloe and Josh's wedding day, Helen didn't appear happy. Chloe told her that she and Henry would sit behind Emily and me during the ceremony. The church service went smoothly, and I agreed to seat Helen at the top table during the reception. Meanwhile, Henry sat with Emily, Robert, Gary, and Lee. After the speeches, the caterers cleared some tables to make room for dancing. Josh and Chloe led the first dance, and Emily and I joined them, along with Helen and Henry. Later, I found myself at the bar, sitting with Gary and Robert. They were chatting with one of Chloe's bridesmaids and some of her friends. Lee asked Emily if she wanted to dance, and I encouraged her to join him. Helen, who had clearly had a few drinks, seized the opportunity to approach me. I realized this conversation might not end well. She began by commenting on Emily, noting how young she looked despite being a mother of 2 boys. Helen then criticized Emily's appearance, mentioning her weight and choice of dress. I reminded Helen that we were divorced and that she no longer had the right to comment on my life. Helen continued making derogatory remarks about Emily, prompting me to defend my wife. I told Helen that Emily was more of a woman than she ever was, and hinted at the satisfying intimacy I shared with her. When Henry joined the conversation, Emily walked up to us, leaving Helen speechless. I told Helen that when she left me, she believed she was trading up for something better. Whether she did or didn't wasn't my concern anymore because I had moved on. I had a life of my own, a loving wife, and 4 amazing children. I left Helen and Henry to themselves and walked away to dance with Emily. As we swayed to the slow music, Emily asked about the bar conversation. I promised to explain later and asked her for a kiss. We shared a kiss, fully aware that Helen was watching. Breaking the kiss, I glanced at Helen, who turned to order another drink. When I looked at Emily, I couldn't help but think about how fortunate I was.